What will you leave behind when the lights go out? Explore the powerful legacies of those who fought for justice and the stories that define our very existence. Experience storytelling with a soul. Click subscribe now and be part of our growing legacy.
Hemant A. Dung, Natalie, Daniel, Melissa, Priya, Claire, Marcus, Ryan, Donna, June, Theodore, Carla, Harriet, Weston, Phyllis, Kevin, Amber, Vanessa, Gordon, Owen, Sasha, Iris, Brooke, Loretta, Stephanie, Gerald, Eloise, Conrad, Renata, Sandra, Rekawai, Renata, Sandra, Tim, Hanka Itoy Sada Jigun, Lian, and Fine Tutha Sambatumb Ichin Jikin, Kut Abaka, Chuya Ekam. Breton, Bretum, Butbun, Benzabum, Tana, Iti, Anhan, Ahand, Bun Miles, Utlaf, Unwiz, Amotamvel, Ho, Yamwinesh, Hasho, Hathamasa, Leah, Forensic Accountant, Thump, Ha, Fop, Vum, Itwisik Te, Twin Itek, By Ivma, Beamer, Revenge Bite, Vum Uvna, Ha, Hathan, Kasho, Ifaha, Fong Fa, Kak. Fon fa ha. Isit heffen kank avung fa ha. Ite, Kumer immer husband, announced to a room full of people that I was, quote, just background noise. Let me tell you that I smiled when he said it. I smiled the way you smile when a waiter drops your food and you say it's fine. Reflex. Muscle memory, from years of practice. The room didn't go quiet right away. People laughed a little, the way people laugh when they're not sure if something was a joke. My husband laughed the loudest. He always did, and then I answered him, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Leah, and for 11 years I was married to a man who built his entire identity around the idea that he had married beneath him. I know how that sounds. I know what you're already thinking. Why did you stay? Why did you let him? Why didn't you just leave? I've thought all of those things too. I've sat in my car in parking garages at 11 p.m. after 12-hour days and asked myself every single version of that question. The honest answer is that it wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 small things that each seemed survivable on their own. When I met Brett, I was 29. He was 34. He had a real estate development company, mid-size, profitable, the kind of business that looks very impressive until you understand the industry well enough to know it's mostly leveraged debt and contractor relationships. He wore good suits. He talked about his projects with the kind of confidence that makes you think someone knows what they're doing. I was a senior analyst at a forensic accounting firm at the time. I investigated financial fraud. I reviewed company books, found discrepancies, worked with attorneys and sometimes federal agencies when cases went that far. It was not glamorous work. It involved a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of very dry conversations with very serious people. But I was good at it. My supervisor at the time said I had an instinct for it, that I could look at a column of numbers and feel when something was wrong before I could explain why. Brett liked me a lot in the beginning. He liked that I was serious. He liked that I didn't need to be entertained. He liked that I could hold my own at dinner conversations with his business contacts. What he didn't like, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was that I might ever be more serious than him. More capable, more credible in a room. I remember the first time he asked me not to bring up my job at a work dinner of his. We'd been married about 8 months. He said it casually, the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. These guys are a little old-fashioned. Just let me do the talking tonight, okay? I thought it was a one-time thing. A specific crowd. I thought I was being flexible, being a good partner. It became the default. Over the years it became, don't mention what firm you work with. Just say you're in finance. Don't mention the federal cases, it makes people uncomfortable. Don't mention your salary. Don't mention that the reason we could afford the house we're in is partly because of what you bring home. I told myself these were small things, compromises. The kind of thing couples do. Cecily, my closest friend since college, told me something different. She said it over coffee one Saturday about 3 years into my marriage, very gently, the way Cecily always says hard things. He's not asking you to be low profile, Leah. He's asking you to be invisible. I told her she was being dramatic. I was wrong. The dinner happened on a Friday in March. Brett's firm was hosting a cocktail reception at the Harrington Club downtown. The kind of place with dark wood paneling and a dress code and waitstaff who refill your water glass before it's half empty. His biggest investor, a man named Doug, was in town with his wife and a few associates. Brett had been building toward this meeting for months. A new development project, something large-scale on the west side of the city. He needed Doug's continued backing. I wore a navy dress I'd had for 2 years. I'd had my hair done. I arrived having reviewed nothing, prepared nothing, intending to do exactly what I'd agreed to do, stand beside my husband, smile appropriately, and be pleasant and unremarkable. For the first hour, that's what I did. Then Doug's wife, a warm woman named Harriet, a woman whose name I won't use. She asked me what I did. Just casually, the way people make conversation. She'd mentioned her own background in corporate law, and she turned to me naturally, genuinely curious. I started to answer. I said, I'm in, and Brett was already beside me. She works in finance, he said. Numbers stuff, very behind the scenes. He laughed. I always say she's the quiet one in the relationship. The woman nodded politely, moved on. I stood there with the second half of my sentence still sitting in my throat. An hour later, we were in a loose circle near the bar. Brett, Doug, 2 of Doug's associates, and me. Brett was talking about the new project, laying out the vision, and he was good at it. I'll give him that. He knew how to make a pitch feel like a story. But then Doug asked a question about the financial structure of the deal, something specific about the equity split and the holding company arrangement, and Brett started talking and I could genuinely see that he was glossing over something, not lying exactly, but not accurate either. Without thinking, I said, actually, the way the holdco is structured, there's a consideration there around the liability allocation. Brett looked at me, not at the group, at me. Leah. He smiled, but his eyes didn't. The adults are talking. Nobody laughed. There was a half-second of uncomfortable silence, and then Doug said something to redirect, and the moment passed. But I heard it. Everyone heard it. Everyone heard it. I excused myself to use the restroom. I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists, and I thought, 11 years. I thought about the number of times I had made myself smaller so he could feel larger. The number of dinners. The number of times I'd said, I'm in finance when what I meant was I find the money people hide. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. And then I went back out. I want to be clear about something. What happened next was not a decision I made in that bathroom. It was a decision I had been slowly making for about 14 months, since the night I'd come home late from a case and found a text on Brett's unlocked phone from a number saved as T that said, can't stop thinking about last night. Since I'd taken a photograph of that text with my own phone before putting his back exactly where I found it. Since I'd started, quietly and methodically and with the specific skill set I had spent 15 years developing, paying attention. I was a forensic accountant. I found things people hid. It turned out my husband had been hiding quite a lot. The woman's name was Tanya. She worked in the marketing department of one of Brett's contractor companies. The relationship had been going on for at least 2 years. That was the personal piece, and as much as it hurt, and it did hurt, in that hollow specific way that betrayal hurts even when you've already half suspected it, it wasn't actually the most interesting thing I found. The more interesting thing was the money. Brett's firm handled a lot of pass-through transactions, money from investors, money to contractors, money into LLCs with anodyne names and registered agents in Delaware. From the outside, it looked like normal real estate deal flow. From the inside, from where I sat, with the training I had and the access I had quietly begun gathering over 14 months, it looked like something else. Inflated contractor invoices paid to shell companies, disbursements to entities that didn't appear to do anything, a pattern of payments that seemed designed to move money from investor accounts into accounts that Brett controlled personally, dressed up as legitimate business expenses. I had not gone looking for this. I want to say that clearly. I had gone looking for evidence of the affair. Something concrete, something I could use in a divorce proceeding. The financial picture had simply emerged because I knew how to look, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I spent 3 months organizing what I'd found. I worked carefully. I worked the way I worked on cases at my firm, methodically, without emotion, building a clear and documented picture. I didn't tell Brett. I didn't tell Cecily. I didn't tell anyone. I did, eventually, have a quiet and very specific conversation with a contact I had at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Not an accusation, just a conversation. The kind where you describe a hypothetical pattern and ask what a person might do if they encountered it in real life. My contact listened carefully. She said, "Document everything and sit tight." So I did. The night of the Harrington Club dinner, I went back to the table. Brett handed me a fresh drink. He was charm itself for the rest of the evening, attentive, funny, arm around my shoulder at one point, the picture of a happy marriage. Doug seemed pleased. The pitch had landed. On the drive home, Brett was in a good mood. He talked about the deal. Somewhere around the third stoplight, he said without looking at me, "You almost derailed that back there." I said, "I know. I just need you to trust me in those rooms, Leah." "I know," I said again. He reached over and squeezed my hand. "That's my girl." I looked out the window and thought about a spreadsheet I'd saved to an encrypted drive in my desk drawer at work. I thought about 14 months of documentation. I thought about my contact at the FBI and the words "sit tight." I thought, not much longer. The company's annual investor dinner was 6 weeks later. Bigger event, hotel ballroom, about 80 people. This was the one Brett had been building toward all year. It was where he planned to formally announce the new West Side project and introduce Doug as the lead investor. It was meant to be his moment. He'd talked about it for months. I attended in a black dress. I sat at the table Brett had assigned me, beside Patricia, his mother, a woman who had spent a decade treating me with the particular condescension reserved for daughters-in-law who were not quite good enough, and across from two couples I'd met twice before and would likely never see again. Dinner proceeded. Speeches were made. Brett took the podium at 8:45 and I watched him work the room the way I'd watched him do it 100 times, and I thought, he's very good at this. He was. Whatever else was true about my husband, he could hold a room. He introduced Doug. He talked about the project. He was 45 minutes into a 50-minute evening. And then Doug stood up to say a few words, and he made a small joke about the people behind successful people. And he looked in my direction. Not at me specifically, just at our table. And he said something about how the real work always happens quietly. And Brett, relaxed now, celebratory, said into his microphone with the particular ease of a man who has said too much, "My wife knows all about quiet work. She's been doing it for 11 years and I still don't know what she does all day." People laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Patricia smiled into her wine glass. I felt the room do its little collective recalibration. That half second where people decide whether something was a joke or a grenade, and I felt 80 pairs of eyes or their equivalent glance my direction. I had a choice in that moment. I had practiced what I would do in this moment, actually, rehearsed it, the way I rehearse things, methodically and without sentimentality. I knew I could sit quietly. I knew I could smile. I had been doing it for 11 years. I put my napkin on the table. I stood up. "Actually," I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. "I should probably introduce myself properly, since apparently my husband and I tell different stories." The room got very still. "I'm Leah. I'm a forensic accountant. I work in financial fraud investigation. I've consulted on 43 federal cases in the last decade. And for the last 14 months, I've been doing what I do best." I paused. "I think the people from the SEC who are going to be here Monday morning can explain the rest." The silence was the specific kind that happens when everyone in a room is trying very hard not to look at one particular person. I looked at Brett. He had gone the color of old paper. "You need someone who meets your standards," I said. "I think we both know you don't meet mine." I picked up my clutch from the back of my chair. I walked across the ballroom, across the marble floor that I had stood on 100 times at 100 events being background noise, and I walked out the front door. I won't pretend it felt like a movie. My hands were shaking by the time I got to the parking garage. I sat in my car for a while. I called Cecily and she didn't say anything for almost 10 seconds, and then she said, "Oh my God," several times in a row. I cried a little, not from sadness exactly, from the particular release of something you've been holding for a very long time. The next 3 months were not easy. They were also not as hard as I had expected. My contact at the FBI had not been idle. The investigation had been moving on its own timeline, gathering its own documentation. What I had provided 14 months earlier had been, as she put it, a useful starting point. Brett's attorney contacted my attorney the week after the dinner. There were conversations I was not part of. There were conversations I was. Brett was indicted 4 months later. Investor fraud, wire fraud, several related charges. Doug, who it turned out had not known the extent of what was happening in the underlying financials, cooperated with investigators. The West Side Project was unwound. The firm was placed under court supervision pending the outcome. The divorce was finalized 7 months after the dinner. My attorney was very good. The settlement reflected the reality of what I had contributed to 11 years of that marriage, including the financial contributions Brett had spent a decade minimizing. Patricia sent me one text. It said, "I hope you're satisfied." I didn't respond. I was, in fact, satisfied. Not in the way I might have imagined when I was 29 and newly married, and still believed that love meant you tried to become what someone needed you to be. But satisfied in the way you feel when you finally stop carrying something that was never yours to carry. I moved into an apartment in March, just over a year after the dinner. It's a good apartment. I have a home office with a very large desk and a wall of filing cabinets and a window that looks out over a courtyard, where there are sometimes pigeons. It is not a luxury ballroom. I do not miss luxury ballrooms. A few weeks after I moved in, my firm offered me a partnership. The conversation had apparently been happening for a while, and I'd been too busy with everything else to notice it building. The partner track at a forensic accounting firm is not the kind of thing that happens quickly. It means something. I accepted. Cecily came over the night I found out. We opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving without knowing I was saving it for something. We sat on the floor because I still didn't have enough furniture. We talked for 4 hours. At one point she said, "Do you think you would have gotten here without all of it? Without him?" I thought about that for a while. "I got here in spite of him," I said. "Not because of him. There's a difference." She raised her glass. I raised mine. I think about that ballroom sometimes. I think about the moment I stood up, how the room went still, how Brett's face changed. I think about Patricia and her wine glass. I think about Doug and his associates and the 2 couples I'd met twice and will probably never see again. I think about the woman I was at the bathroom mirror at the Harrington Club, running cold water over my wrists, telling myself it was fine. I want to say something to anyone who recognizes any part of that woman. You don't have to get dramatic. You don't have to make a speech. You don't have to plan 14 months ahead or have a contact at the FBI or understand the precise mechanics of holding company liability structures. Most people don't, and that's fine. That's normal. That's the whole point. But you do have to stop making yourself small. You do have to stop letting someone treat your competence as an inconvenience. You do have to, at some point, say the full sentence, the one that starts with, "I'm in finance," and ends with, "I find the money people hide," and let it sit in the room and take up the space it deserves. You have been doing quiet work for a long time. Let people know. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any cosmic sense. I'm not someone who believes the universe keeps score, or that things balance out because they're supposed to. I believe they balance out because they're supposed to. Specifically because people make choices over and over again, and those choices accumulate into outcomes. Brett made choices. I made choices. And the distance between where we each ended up is exactly the distance between those choices. Brett chose for 11 years to treat competence as a threat. Every time he said, "She's just in finance," every time he cut me off mid-sentence at a dinner table, every time he squeezed my hand in the car and called me his girl after humiliating me in public, he was making a choice. He was choosing what kind of person he wanted to be, and what kind of marriage he wanted to build, and what kind of man he wanted his investors and colleagues and mother to see. He chose consistently and clearly. The outcome was consistent and clear. I made choices too. I chose for a long time to absorb things that I should have named out loud. I told myself that was flexibility, that it was partnership, that it was love. I think some of it was fear. Fear of disruption. Fear of being wrong about someone I had chosen. That's not weakness, exactly. It's just human, but it was still a choice, and it cost me years. What changed wasn't one night. It was 14 months of a different kind of choosing. I chose to pay attention. I chose to use what I actually knew instead of pretending I didn't know it. I chose to be methodical instead of emotional. Not because emotion was wrong, but because method was what I was good at, and I had spent a decade hiding that. Every quiet hour in my office, every encrypted file, every careful conversation, those were choices, and they accumulated too. The thing about integrity is that it's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. Brett stood at that podium and made himself very large and very loud, and I think he genuinely believed that was what power looked like. It looked impressive, it always had, but the whole time he was building that performance, I was building something else. Something quieter, something documented, something that didn't need an audience to be real. Trish, his mother, sent me that text, and I think she expected me to feel something she could use. Shame, maybe, or regret. I felt neither. I felt the particular clarity that comes when you stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided what you are. Cecily asked me once whether I would do it differently if I could. I've turned that question over more times than I can count. I think I would speak sooner, not to Brett, he wasn't listening, but to myself. I would stop performing smallness and start living at the actual size of what I knew and what I was capable of. That's the thing. I go back and tell the woman running cold water over her wrists in that bathroom, you don't have to earn the right to take up space. You already earned it. You've been earning it for years. Resilience isn't about surviving the hard thing. It's about not letting the hard thing teach you the wrong lesson. The wrong lesson would have been, stay quiet, stay small, next time don't say anything at all. The right lesson was simpler. Do the work, document everything, know what you know. And when someone hands you a microphone, even accidentally, even while trying to diminish you, use it.